Welcome to this very brief screencast on AJAX using jQuery's functions for supporting AJAX. So what is AJAX? It's asynchronous JavaScript in XML. So what we do is we can make asynchronous calls, function calls, or requests, HTTP requests in the background. When the request is finished, a function or a callback function will be executed in our browser, and so this allows us to display information on the web page without reloading the web page. So we can go make a request out there, get some new data, update the web page, and we won't have had to reload the location.reload or window reload function. It's a standard functionality that JavaScript supports. jQuery has simplified writing all this AJAX code greatly. It makes it much easier to write AJAX code than using just straight JavaScript. So what is the functionality? First off, we're doing a load function. It's a very powerful AJAX method. It basically puts the return data into the selected element. So you use, again, the $ selector, call the load method, provided a URL, where are you going to go make your GET request, the data that optional data that you want to supply in the GET request, and then a callback function, the optional function that needs a response text, status text, and the XML header is what you're going to get. So the function will run when the load is completed. Again, you can see the data is sort of the key value pairs. That's the query string that you would send in the request. And so what happens is the data will be the results of the load, the results of the request to the URL will be placed into the item that you selected. You could do that for maybe updating a score or something, or updating the weather or something. It's a very nice feature that you can go out and load some data from the internet. The callback function, like we were talking about, has a response, a status, and a header. So the response is the data that came back. It might be an HTML page, it might be a JSON object, it could be text, it could be whatever the response of the request is. The status tells you what happened to the request. It was successful, it was not modified, error, timeout, parse error, etc. And then the XHR contains the XML HTTP request object, so you could see what the request object looked like and get some information about the request object. The GET is a GET request, very similar to the load. You say URL, again the data, any key value pairs you want to send to the GET request, the callback function that you want to run when it returns, and the data type. So you can specify the kind of data that you would like the server to respond to you in. Some choices are XML, HTML, text, script, JSON. Often servers have the ability to return that path, the resource, in different representations. You could have an XML object, you can have a JSON object. It's a different representation of the same resource. You return as text. So there's all sorts of different kinds of data type that you want the data back. The server may or may not give you back the data in the requested type. It's up to the server to satisfy your request or give you back or not satisfy your request. Yes, it's a GET request. Post request, exactly the same thing, except for using HTTP post. Again, we have the URL, the data, any additional data you want to send to the server. That might be the contents of your form. The callback is a function that will run when we get the return. And then again, the data type we expect the server to respond. Do we want XML, HTML, text, JSON? What do we want the response to be in? And then the generic AJAX request. So this is the generic, so we have the $ AJAX call, name value pairs, which are the things that we need to supply. So one of the things that we need to supply would be the URL, colon, and then the URL that we're trying to do our AJAX request of. Type, what type of request? Is a GET or POST, or a delete, or a generic. This is HTTP request. We can do any kind of requests there are, as we talked about earlier in the different HTTP request types. Content is what is the thing, the this for callback functions. So where do you want the stuff to go, in sense? We have a success function that will run if the request is successful. We have an error function that will run if there is an error in the request. And then we have a complete function that will run every time after the request is finished, whether there was a success or error. So this is your generic AJAX HTTP request format. So you supply the URL, you can type the type of the request, the contents is the this for callback. So let's say you want to insert the data into a particular item or whatever, that would be your this. You have a success function that will run if the request is successful. You have an error function that will run if there's an error in the request. And then a complete function that will run, doesn't matter whether it's successful or error, it will run every time. So it's a very flexible way of making HTTP requests. And again, the success or failure error functions, the results of the request. So in the success, that would probably be the data that you asked for, and you could do whatever you want with the data. Error, you're going to get the result, the kind of the error code message that you're going to get, the status of error, and then you actually get the request object that caused the error. So very flexible, very powerful. Remember, it's asynchronous, so the callbacks will run whenever the request happens. The page does not block, it's just it went out the request, and when the results come back, that's when the page will be updated. Thank you for your attention on this very, very brief overview of the jQuery AJAX functions.